Israel, Iran, and the threat of wider war. My name is Chris Nynham. I'm the Vice Chair of the Stop the War Coalition. I'll be chairing tonight. And we are hosting this briefing to help understand the dynamics of what is a more and more dangerous situation in the Middle East, already racked by the terrible genocide of the Palestinian people in Gaza. It's a discussion that is important in itself, but it's also aimed to help strengthen the anti-war movement, the tremendous movement in solidarity with the Palestinians. We have 4 excellent speakers, each of whom will speak for 12 to 15 minutes. And then I have a few announcements at the end. So without further ado, I'm going to start with Trita Parsi. Welcome, Trita. Trita's an expert on US-Iran relations and a member of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Chris, and thank you all of you at Stop the War Coalition for the tremendously important work you are doing and have been doing for such a long time. I cannot emphasize more how crucial it is in this moment as the trajectory of developments in the region now is coming to a head and we are closer to a major confrontation in the Middle East than we have been for the last 20 or so years. I think the events of the last 2 weeks should tell us how dangerous the situation is, but also should avoid giving us false hope. If we take a look at what happened after Israel struck the Iranian consulate in Damascus on April 1st, the Iranians waited roughly 12 days before they responded. It was not clear from the outset whether they would do it or not. They eventually did, but then they did it in a manner that was clearly choreographed to not inflict major danger on damage on the Israelis, but rather showcase their capabilities and essentially change the rules of the game in which the Israelis no longer could strike at Iran in the region without risking retaliation. And then there was the Israeli response in return, which the Iranians had promised to respond to swiftly and forcefully, but then instead decided to treat as if it hadn't been an attack in the first place because it was so limited and measured. It appears, though, that 3 ballistic missiles did hit one of the Iranian bases, while the Iranians are claiming that the attack was only by drones that had been flown from inside the country itself. Behind the scenes, the Biden administration was working to make sure that the Iranian response was limited and muted and that it wouldn't inflict major damage, and then putting pressure on the Israelis not to respond at all, and if they did so in such a manner that the Iranians essentially could pretend as if they had not been attacked at all. And in this limited episode, although crucial, I think the Biden administration deserves some credit for having managed the orchestration of this so that both sides could do something without escalating it into a full-scale war. However, and I want to say a very big however here, a tactical success within a larger strategic defeat is still not worthy of much celebration, because it is the Biden administration itself, together with its partners in Europe, particularly the UK, that have set the stage for us to get to this situation in the first place, leading us on a trajectory that is bringing the region, as well as other countries from outside of the region, onto the precipice of war. And I would point to 2 things in particular that have our policies that the Biden administration has pursued that has put us on this very dangerous trajectory. First off is the refusal of the Biden administration to exercise its influence over Israel to change its conduct and prevent it from broader escalation and war crimes. And this, of course, has been manifested in not only the refusal to press them on a ceasefire, the blocking of a ceasefire 3 times at the UN, the 4th resolution that the United States allowed to pass by only abstaining on it. Nevertheless, Biden returned to undermined swiftly by falsely declaring that it was non-binding. In the meantime, there's been arms sales in the midst of an alleged genocide, the sidestepping of Congress twice in order to get the weapons faster to the Israelis, all without making any effort to actually put a stop to the fighting. And this has then led to the slaughter in Gaza, fueling the conflicts throughout the region. We've seen how it has fueled the attacks by the Houthis, whose demand has been a very clear and simple one, even if the mainstream media oftentimes has failed to mention it, which is that they will stop attacking the ships if Israel stopped bombing Gaza. Similarly, Iraqi and Syrian militias aligned with Iran, who attacked American bases and troops in a massive scale compared to before, as an effort to pressure the United States to put pressure on the Israelis to stop the fighting in Gaza. Also increased to the level in which at one point 3 American soldiers were killed. The United States responded with kinetic force. A lull has now been created between them, but it may now have been broken with what happened not only on April 1st, but what Israel did last night, or allegedly did last night, with a strike against one of those militias outside of Baghdad. Had the United States and the West pressured Israel for a ceasefire from the outset, not only with 35,000 Palestinians, the vast majority of them women and children, not been slaughtered and killed, we would also not have seen this escalation through the region, in which the US almost went to war with the Houthis on a larger scale, and Iran and Israel almost brought the entire region into a larger war. The second major policy blunder, in my view, that has also helped set the stage for this disaster is that the Biden administration has continued, embraced, and built upon the Abraham Accords of the Trump administration, an effort to essentially say that peace in the region and between Israelis and Palestinians no longer will be achieved through a two-state solution, but rather through the economic integration between Israel and some major Arab states. The United States has offered significant concessions to these Arab states, and in the case of Saudi Arabia, reportedly even defense commitments, as well as granting Saudi Arabia the nuclear fuel cycles, which the US, of course, fought very hard to make sure that the Iranians wouldn't have. But did all of this in return for these Arab states dropping the demand for a Palestinian state to be created in order for them to recognize Israel. So one of the last pieces of leverage that the Arab world had in pressing Israel to recognize and allow a Palestinian state to be created, the United States bribed away and essentially put forward a vision that peace will be created not by actually getting the Palestinians a state, but by having direct flights between Tel Aviv and Riyadh and Tel Aviv and Dubai. This effort then made sure that the diplomatic path, the peaceful path for the Palestinians to be able to reach their national right to independence and self-determination was shut close. 20, 30 years of investment in a false peace process ended not with a collapse, but with a celebration that a Palestinian state would not be created, which then, of course, created a situation in which a return to armed struggle and violence became all the more realistic. And I think it's noteworthy here that Biden did not just adopt what Trump had started. He desperately tried to outdo Trump by outdoing him, including the biggest Arab state, the most important Arab state, Saudi Arabia, a country that Trump himself had not managed to get to when he left office, but had started the Abraham Accords process. All of this has now created a situation that we are seeing on the ground, a return to violence and resistance by the Palestinians because the West effectively shut close the path to peaceful creation of a Palestinian state. while then at the same time refusing a ceasefire, arming Israel while it is committing war crimes, which then has now led to a situation in which we may have, and we still risk, a major regional war. So within that, helpful that there was an orchestration to make sure that the worst outcome of the trajectory that Biden himself has helped put us on was avoided. But unless Biden and the West adopts a policy that changes that trajectory and actually creates an ability to be able to, through diplomacy, create a Palestinian state instead of blocking it, and actually bring real peace and security for the region, as well as for the United States and Europe, then this has to be a very limited amount of praise granted to the Biden administration. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Trita. That was fascinating. I will move now to our second speaker, Kate Hudson, who is General Secretary of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. Over to you, Kate.
Thanks very much, Chris, and thanks for organising this very timely meeting. And of course, as Trita has already explained, over the last few days, we've seen a significant risk of major escalation in the Middle East. I think it's clear to everybody that unrestrained conflict between the region's two most significant military powers would be disastrous. So in my brief time, I'd just like to look at the background and context to this conflict and really to try and get beyond the very limited media reporting that we have, particularly of the situation in Iran. Although the US is currently attempting to drain Israel, it appears, there's no doubt that it's played a huge part in creating a culture of hostility and warmongering towards Iran, not to mention, of course, direct intervention. And at least since the 1953 coup, which was organised by the US and UK to overthrow the progressive Arab nationalist leader Mossadegh, democratically elected leader, the United States has had a strong hand in regional destabilization in the Middle East. And of course, this has been to pursue its own interests. The 53 coup was essentially to retain control over Iranian oil. So the oil factor that is always present there in the US policies and orientation. And then secondly, to prevent at that time Soviet influence. So the question of geostrategic control is always a factor for the Americans as well. So those two factors, the kind of oil energy nexus, and then of course the geostrategic kind of political control and intervention. So the Shah was imposed by the US and the UK, followed by pretty much unbridled corruption and repression within Iran, which, as many of us will remember, I think, looking at the screens, eventually led to the Islamic Revolution in 1979. And I think it's fair to say that the United States has been determined on regime change in Iran ever since. And I'm sure we all again particularly remember how this is very notably ratcheted up by George Bush in 2002, in the context of the imminent war in Iraq. In his Axis of Evil speech, he had Iran on there with Iraq and North Korea. And I think it was very telling, in terms of Britain's role in these developments, how it's just a matter of weeks since Grant Shapps was listing his countries against which we may have war in the next few years. Iran again was on that list, and it's a very pretty shocking last week, but not surprising, of course, how David Cameron, was pretty much the first out off the starting blocks to call for compliance with Israel's call for sanctions on Iran following the drone and missile attacks, even though no one had actually been killed in those attacks. So Britain very much there with the United States on its anti-Iran policy. And so it's no surprise that for some years, no war in Iran has been a very necessary slogan for our movement. And I believe that it is once again a necessary slogan for our movement, not least because Western intervention has been an absolute catastrophe in the Middle East, wherever it has been shown. The key means of demonizing Iran in the last couple of decades has been through misrepresenting its nuclear program and repeatedly suggesting that Iran has nuclear weapons. Now, of course, this isn't the case. Israel is the only nuclear weapons state in the Middle East. It has a significant arsenal with 3 different delivery platforms. They are outside all international restraints, outside any legislation or inspections. Now, of course, Iran does have a nuclear power program, which interestingly was begun in 1967 during the reign of the Shah, and the United States helped launch the Iranian program with a reactor fueled by highly enriched uranium. Work was halted after the revolution, but by the late 1980s, it was restarted with support from China, Russia, and Pakistan. So, as I'm sure you're aware, Iran has always maintained that its program is solely for peaceful purposes, and it's periodically made the strong case that it wishes to diversify away from oil dependency, and so this is its intention. There was some doubt at the turn of this century about Iran's motives, because it appeared to be enriching uranium at a far higher level than was necessary for nuclear power alone. And as a result, in 2002, the IAEA inspections took place. And in 2004, Iran agreed to suspend nuclear activities. But this broke down in 2005. And you may remember that President Ahmadinejad at that time insisted on Iran's sovereign right to develop nuclear power. And much as CND is opposed to all forms of nuclear power by anybody, one has to recognize that under international law, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, they do have the sovereign right to develop nuclear energy, nuclear power for energy purposes. Sanctions were imposed, and then negotiations continued for some years. And then it appeared that there was a positive development. Well, there was a positive development. In fact, in 2015, an agreement was reached under President Obama and President Rouhani of Iran. It's backed by the P5 and by the UN Security Council. And this agreed to limits on the enrichment level, the reduction of the uranium stockpile in Iran, IAEA inspections, and the lifting of the bans and sanctions and the unfreezing of Iranian assets. So this was an incredibly positive development, and everything was going well. And then, hey presto, in 2018, guess what? President Trump announced US withdrawal from this treaty, even though it was all going really well. And the guy claimed, he said he was pulling out of it to prevent Iran getting a nuclear weapon, and the whole purpose of the thing, which was working very well, was to make sure that that wasn't possible, even supposing Iran did want a nuclear weapon, which has never been proven. So clearly, I would say that Trump walked away from the agreement so that the US could reimpose sanctions on Iran to knock back Iran's role as a significant regional power. Because, of course, the result of the Iran nuclear deal was the kind of the unfreezing of the assets and the end of the sanctions. And Iran was once again re-emerging as a kind of preeminent regional economic power. So obviously Trump wanted to knock that back. So this is the recurrent theme in US policy and UK policy towards Iran. Iran is non-compliant with the policies, the economy, and worldview of the United States. So the United States makes persistent efforts to marginalize and weaken Iran and ultimately seek regime change. Of course, the United States is still backing Israel as its major strategic ally in the Middle East, but Israel has now gone so rogue, of course, that even the United States has to try and prevent it launching an all-out regional war. So, it's a situation in flux. I think the underlying trends are very clear and very consistent, but it's a very, very dangerous situation. And I think it very much has to be one of the key priorities of our movement, as well as supporting the ceasefire, prioritizing an end to the genocide in Gaza. We have to work to prevent an escalation of this terrible catastrophe into an all-out regional war. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kate, for that very useful summary of the kind of history that underlies the current crisis and the way that imperialism has intervened against Iran. Our next speaker is Maryam Eslamdoust. She is the General Secretary of the TSSA union, one of the trade union leaders who's played a leading role, a very public role in support of the Palestinians. It's great to have you with us, Maryam.
Thank you, Chris. Good afternoon, friends. May I start by saying it's an honour to speak alongside Trita Parsi, John and Kate, who are all considered for voices on Iran and on international relations more widely. I guess I'm here both because I'm a union general secretary, long-time supporter of Stop the War, and sometimes member of Stop the War steering committee, but also because I'm Iranian. Trita has covered the Palestinian context very well, so I'll talk a bit about the Iranian character, the Iranian psyche, and the Iranian attitude to war. Firstly, I'm talking in generalizations about our character, but it's important to say that the media narrative of the Iranians, as if we're all one homogenous block, is rubbish. We are individuals just like everyone else, but there are some commonalities which I will speak to. I don't really like Billy Bragg's music, but there's a line in a Billy Bragg song, Think Again, which says, "Do you think that the Russians want war? These are the sons and daughters of parents who died in the last one." And I think that's a really good starting point to understand the average Iranian's attitude to war. We don't want it. The Iran-Iraq war was only a generation ago. Every single Iranian has dads, uncles, brothers, sons, all killed in that war. More Iranians were killed in that war than the total of British who died in World War II. My brother, who's been blind since infancy because of medical sanctions on Iran during that war, there's still millions of Iranians that live with the health consequences of the Western supplied chemical weapons used against us by Iraq. I remember the horrors of air raids when I was a young child and the fear of jets and missiles raining down on Tehran. So Iranians are not a people that love war. We know more than anyone the terrible consequences of war. Just watching the news, you'd think that all Iranians are bloodthirsty warmongers if you believe that media narrative. But I think it's important to understand that the attitude of anti-war goes long back. Probably, I guess it'll be the mid-18th century to find you'd have to go back as far back as the 18th century to find an example of Iran being the aggressor in any international war. So how do we get to this situation? It's clear that the Iranian leadership didn't want to risk a wider war. Most states with the military capability, with Iran's military capability, would have responded with maximum aggression to a deliberate and deadly bombing of diplomatic facilities. It can't be underestimated just how far outside of international norms it is for Israel to bomb Iran's consulate in Damascus. So it's clear that Iran's leaders felt forced into a military reaction. Something finally had to give. Iranians hate war, but Iran's national sovereignty is not negotiable. And it's obvious that Israel's sorry, so emotionally involved in this. It was very clear that Netanyahu would have taken this opportunity to blow up the regional conflict, which has so often been something he has stated he wants. So Iran has endured years of covert attacks from Israel, mostly without reaction, but there have been attempts to sabotage civil nuclear facilities with the risk of radioactive leaks and meltdowns, assassinations of scientists and officials, even on the streets of Tehran. And there's been suspected involvement in militia attacks within Iran. But the destruction of diplomatic facilities was a step too far for Iran's leadership. It may have looked spectacular, even in the style of and mode of a response by Iran is indicative of intention to contain a current situation. The Iranian military essentially made a public announcement of the attack. They used slow-moving drones. They chose to launch all drones and missiles directly from Iranian soil, so that there were several hours for Israel's air defense to respond. And Iran stated that it would have considered that matter closed. Of course, Israel has rejected that offer. We've seen this week the aerial attacks on Iranian soil, but actually we probably should recognize that Israel's attacks this week were clearly somewhat restrained and limited compared to the scale of their military capacity. Presumably, this was because of the US's pressure to avoid full-out regional conflict. So it's clear that there is serious risk of regional conflict, as Trita has very clearly defined. But while a ground war would unlikely be of ground war would be unlikely because of the distance between Israel and Iran, but there's a terrifying prospect of open aerial and naval war combined with actions by proxies and allied states. It's obvious that Israel's political leadership want it. Netanyahu has been refreshingly honest over many years about his desire for war with Iran. But there are genuine reasons to hope that wider conflict can be avoided. Both states have shown welcome restraint in how they have conducted their aerial responses so far. Iran clearly does not want wider conflict. The Iranian state continues in its strong rhetoric against Israel and remains a resolute supporter of Palestinians. But Iran's military policy doesn't point to any desire for direct conflict with Israel or its allies. I suppose, one also suspects that the Israeli military leadership are probably privately arguing against an expanded conflict that could stretch far beyond their capacity. The US is clearly against a conflict that could grow far beyond the region and have very, very far-reaching consequences for the West. So, just to conclude, I'm not naive as an Iranian. I'm very fearful of war, fearful for my family, but there are reasons for hope. The realism of states involved may just hold them back from war, and that makes it more important than ever for voices of peace here in the West to speak up, to stop our leaders charging the drums of war that could only be a disaster for all involved. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Maryam, and thanks for everything that you do for the movement. I'll just take this opportunity to make one announcement or a kind of reminder maybe for people, which is that there is actually another day of action, of workplace action, coming up relatively soon, which is an opportunity for people in trade unions, maybe some people who aren't in trade unions, to take the movement, take the anti-war, pro-Palestine message into the workplaces. And that's on May the 1st this time. So put that in your diary, anyone who's in work and in a union, and do your best to make sure that there's something going on in your workplace to build the movement, to protest against what our government is doing, and to call for an end to arms sales to Israel. So I will now move on to our final speaker, who is John Rees. John Rees is a writer, he's a broadcaster with the Islam Channel, and he's also an officer of the Stop the War Coalition. Over to you, John.
Thanks very much, Chris, and thanks to the preceding speakers for some really excellent presentations. I just want to start by saying that although when we read about the situation in the Middle East, and especially the events of the last week or so in the Western press, it's presented as if the West has an Iranian problem, I'd just like to start by saying why it might be that if you're an Iranian, and an Iranian who has a memory that stretches back over a lifetime of, say, 70 years, you might think that you've got a problem with the West. Because in living memory, Iranians will know that the first and only attempt at a democratically elected government, that of Mohammad Mossadegh, was ended by a military coup with the more or less open and certainly now admitted complicity and participation of the security services of this country and the security services of the United States. You will know that what followed was a monarchical regime headed by the Shah of Iran, or as he preferred to refer to himself, the King of Kings. And the King of Kings was a Western client regime, which frankly would make the links that the West has with, say, the Saudi regime today pale into insignificance. He was a massive purchaser of Western armaments, and he ran an absolutely brutal internal regime. If you were a student in this country in the 1970s, as I was, you will know that the presence of SAVAK, the Shah's military police, was a thing discussed on every campus in the country, that the Shah would hunt down, capture, and torture, and if not capture and torture, simply kill his opponents around the world, including in universities in this country. That regime, when it was overthrown by the revolution in 1979, a revolution in which there was a significant Iranian working class component, but which eventually ended up in the regime that currently runs Iran today, the theocratic regime of the Ayatollahs, was the overthrow of a Western ally on a scale as if Israel had lost its influence and been transformed, or as if Saudi Arabia had been overthrown and transformed from a Western ally into an independent country. It was precisely because of that that the United States and the West backed Saddam Hussein's Iraq in the Iraq-Iran war. And as Maryam has quite rightly said, that was a destructive war on the scale of the First or Second World War in this country. Some 500,000 military personnel alone killed on both sides of that conflict, which raged for 8 years, twice the length of the First World War in Europe. And of course, it was the hubris of the Saddam Hussein regime, because it had had such unqualified backing by the end of the Iran-Iraq war from the West, which led it to believe that it could invade Kuwait with impunity, and which resulted in the first and arguably in the second Gulf War after sanctions on Iraq failed to remove Saddam Hussein. So there is the most enormous path, the most enormous swathe of physical bloody destruction, which marks out the United States and the United Kingdom's relationship with the Iranian people over that period of time. And the reason why things, I think, have become so dangerous in the Middle East is because the West's response, its repeated response to that situation, has been an abject failure. The Iraq War was another incident, if you like, in that relationship, and it failed in the most catastrophic way. It did not turn Iraq into the stable economic opportunity and pro-Western state which it was hoped that it would. In fact, what it did is destroyed the country and issued in an Iraqi government which is pro-Iranian. The interference of the United States in the Arab revolutions after 2011 has, in the same way, convinced the Houthi movement, which was ultimately a product of that revolutionary wave, removing the then Yemeni dictator, that leaning towards Iran is its best international option. The repeated attempts by Israel, with full Western backing, to invade and subdue Lebanon has resulted in a resistance movement in Hezbollah, which orients towards the Iranians. The failure of the Oslo peace process, pressed on the Palestinian people by the West, by our government and by the United States, has convinced many Palestinians that the PLO is not a viable strategy, that the Oslo peace process has been a disaster for them, and has therefore helped sustain support for Hamas, which has a pro-Iranian political lean. Now, none of these forces in the Middle East are puppets of Iran in the way that they're described in the Western media. They all have perfectly legitimate reasons for not being particularly well disposed towards the West. They all have their own constituencies and their own support bases, which it's simply ridiculous and simply obscures the real political processes in the Middle East to imagine are pro-Iranian in some kind of glove puppet way. But the course of politics in the Middle East has led numerous political forces around the Middle East to look to the Iranian regime and not to any of the pro-Western regimes, which have done everything that they can to prove both that they are their mortal enemies and that their policies in the Middle East are wholly and completely destructive. So the result of Western policy towards Iran itself and towards the struggle of the Palestinians and towards the broader struggle of the Arab masses in the Middle East against their own dictatorships has resulted in a strategic shift in our lifetime to make Iran the most powerful regional player in the Middle East. So US and UK policy has achieved, by its failures and by its repeated hostility to the popular will of people in the Middle East, exactly the opposite of what it sought to achieve. Instead of pro-Western, stable regimes, it's produced massive instability, and it's produced the growth of the Iranian state as a regional power in the area. And that ultimately is what we've seen come to fruition in the past week. It's got to the point where a regional war became a very, very real possibility, and from which we have only stepped back when it came to the very brink of a sustained military exchange. Now, you can say, and I think it's true, that the Iranian response to the bombing of its embassy in Damascus and the Israeli response to that have, in a way, been performative. And it's true that the United States and the Western powers simply didn't want to see the entirety of the region go up in flames. But I don't think that we should see this as the end of the matter. I agree with previous speakers who said that this is simply a more dangerous escalation. The red line of Iran and Israel firing directly on each other's territories has been breached. That's in the past now. We're in a different and more stable, more unstable situation than we have ever been in the Middle East since the fall of the Ottoman Empire in the First World War. The inability of the West to seriously restrain the Israeli state in Gaza has not been resolved, and therefore the consequent conflicts and involvements of Hezbollah, of the Houthis, of Iran now has not been removed. And so the peace movement needs to redouble its efforts and to redouble our explanatory capacity to link these events and to dispel the lies and misconceptions and stereotypes which are so current in our press. This doesn't mean, as it has not meant in any previous conflicts, that we are in favor of the Iranian regime, any more than it meant that we were in favor of the Taliban in Afghanistan or in favor of Saddam Hussein in Iraq. We simply believe that all this history proves beyond any doubt that the one group of people who are absolutely incapable of contributing towards a more democratic and just and stable Middle East are our governments. In every single case, in Afghanistan, a 14-year war which led directly from Taliban rule to, yes, Taliban rule, which destroyed Iraq, which turned Libya, whatever you thought of Muammar Gaddafi, and I didn't think very much of him, turned Libya into a ungovernable territory with slave camps transiting desperate people into Europe. Wherever they have said that they are acting for democracy and peace, the exact opposite has resulted. And it underlines a very simple fact about international relations. The only people who can be trusted with regime change are the people of the country concerned. When the South African masses changed the apartheid regime, they ended up shaping the fate of their country. If it is the 82nd Airborne that does it, then it's the 82nd Airborne that does the ruling afterwards. So we are with the people, for peace, for democracy, and against the rulers here and in the Middle East, who have led to such a disastrous post-war experience for the people of the Middle East.
Thanks very much, John. That's a very good note on which to end the briefing. I'd like to say thanks to all our speakers for a fantastic set of interventions. I hope this meeting has helped put the process of putting the question of stopping the spread of war and stopping the demonization of Iran at the heart of the movement that is on the streets week in, week out at the moment. I just want to end with two announcements. One is something that I'm guessing most of you will know about, but just in case you don't, the next demonstration calling for a ceasefire and calling for an end to the supply of weapons to Israel is taking place next Saturday, the 27th of April, a week today. It's marching from Parliament Square to Hyde Park. It's the first opportunity we've had to be in Hyde Park, so we hope it's going to be another absolutely enormous demonstration. Please do everything you can to promote that event over the next week. The leaflets are available from Stop the War. The graphics are online. The graphics are in the chat as well. We want to turn this into another absolutely massive display of opposition to what the Israelis are doing and to our government. The second announcement is really more of a request to ask you, if you're not members of the Stop the War Coalition, to join tonight. This is partly because it helps us financially, but more importantly, it's absolutely clear, given the situation that has been outlined tonight, the need for a network right across the country, actually internationally, that is committed to campaigning against war, against intervention, against imperialism, could hardly be greater. So we would really appreciate it if after the meeting, you'd go onto our website, look for the join button, and join Stop the War to help strengthen the movement. But thank you all for coming tonight, most importantly. Great turnout, nearly 150 people. Almost everyone stayed right to the end, which is a testimony to the seriousness, really, of the situation. So thank you very much once again, and see you on the streets, hopefully in a week's time on the 27th of April.